Hello again there folks. So before we jump into the main video, I wanted to just give a heads up that I was banned from Patreon recently. And so if you want to keep on, I want to say thanks to everybody who's supported me on there. And I've also been spending quite a bit of time on my Substack, which I'm also using as a bit of a hub. So there's all kinds of content on there that you'll not find anywhere else. I've got quite a few written articles on there, and I'm going to be doing that more in the future because it seems like a place where I can put my stuff instead of it being scattered all over the internet. So if you like what I do and you want to keep up to date with everything that I'm doing, if I go on somebody else's podcast or something, everything will go on my Substack. So I want to thank everybody who supports me, and let's get to it. We mean for some time to do a video essay which is something of a retrospective on the last few years and certainly the last 18 months. My idea was to contrast how the dissident right handled the stresses and strains of the pandemic and contrast it with the left, with the other side, by taking a look in their camp. The problem though is that events don't stop happening. In the modern world, one crisis seems to merge and blend into the next. You never get a few days of clear air and sunshine before the next existential threat hits. In an age where people use superhero movies as reference points to describe wars, it's apt to compare it to a franchise which gets a reboot before the previous series has even ended properly. Consume crisis, get excited for next crisis seems to be the mentality of the age. But there's a steady accumulation of unanswered questions, of story arcs and plot lines that were left unresolved, and they play on your mind as you're forced to invest your time and energy in the all-new and even better narrative imposing itself into the discourse. I ended up with 3 or 4 different scripts for 3 or 4 different videos, but each seemed to be obsolete when it came to wrapping up and recording time. But in the end, looking back on it all, I realised I was actually describing the same thing but from different perspectives. In one video, which I was going to call Cthulhu Submerges, I was going to focus on the problems raised by the last few years and the issue of whether or not it was even possible to go back to normal. H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu is mainly a mystery where the protagonist travels the world in search of clues of some mythic entity, a relic here and a statue there, a rumour or ancient text, and cults and religions across the world all seem to be enthralled to something not from this dimension. It's the story of finding a thread and then tugging at it until eventually the Great One himself rises out of the ocean to reveal his true horror and grandeur. For a time. Then he submerges and becomes once again something of myth and legend. The last few years have revealed things, to me at least, about how we live in the West that, even as a pessimist, I hadn't considered or taken very seriously at all. The sheer scale of the corruption of seemingly benign institutions, the contempt with which oligarchs view not just Europeans, but humanity itself. The drive to digitize everything about our world and eventually transform humanity itself through transhumanism. What really happened in Wuhan? What was the deal with the forced medical interventions? Why was so much data corrupted and incorrect? What damage is being done to people now and into the future by certain medical procedures? What is the connection with Agenda 2030 and where does sovereignty really lie? What exactly is going on with all of the politicians with links to the World Economic Forum? Such questions, and many, many more, could be called loose change, the threads that are left hanging after the news cycle moves on, the foaming water as Cthulhu submerges once again. The dissident right community online seemed to crack in half over these issues, with one camp emerging that argued all this stuff about great resets and was speculation on medical treatments was a distraction from the core issues of demographics and the anti-white agenda. And what's more, the core assumptions of where power truly rested were now seemingly being undermined as well. How does a movement which relies on liberal rights to function cope with rejecting liberalism itself? Now, I don't need to rehash all the drama and arguments here again, but one thing that leaped out at me was that it was all taking place on Odyssey and Telegram, two alt-tech platforms to the big tech mainstream. We were in the digital wastelands, bickering among ourselves like some barbarian horde. But if we were in the Badlands, then who was in the Citadel? And I realised that I hadn't paid any attention at all to the left, the social media left, their influencers, for a very long time. I knew what we were talking about, but what were they up to? At this time, they were trying to get Joe Rogan deplatformed while we were arguing about power structures and core principles. Carl Schmitt, who we hear more and more about these days, once said, "Tell me who your enemies are, and I will tell you who you are." So let's try this out. If we take a random cross-section of people the online right regard as enemies, it would look something like this. People will no doubt be suggesting that this or that other person should be in there, but broadly speaking, and regardless of where people fell on the Coof Wars, this is a typical rogues gallery of right-wing antagonists. The one thing they all have in common, and I suspect the same would be true of people's other suggestions, is that they all, to a man, hold institutional power. The power to create or generate policies which affect how we live in the real world. They have active material and existential consequences. It isn't that Gates is disliked because of his squeaky voice, or Soros because he looks like a turtle. It's because their ability to change the world in ways we seem deeply negative. Many, but not all, arguments that took place on the right over the last year came down to how that network of power melded together and which nodes dominated. This thought experiment can be run on the other side as well. All it takes is 20 minutes of browsing their fully monetized and algo-boosted YouTube channels or their flashy Twitter accounts we aren't allowed. A rogues gallery of the enemies of the progressive left would look something like this. With the exception of Vladimir Putin, or Putla, I think I'm still allowed to say his name at this point on the internet, but I don't know for how much longer. But anyway, none of these men have any institutional power except him, and obviously Putin's power is in opposition to the West. Of the rest, not one of them can create policy. They don't have the power to generate policy. Tucker Carlson comes closest to having institutional power, I suppose, but he doesn't run Fox News. I've also included populism in general. Again, you can quibble about other figures which could be in there, Alex Jones or Nick Fuentes. Maybe in Britain Nigel Farage would slot in there or something. But the pattern is clear. The bulk of the activist left view people as enemies, people who can't create policy, people who have no institutional power but do have mass appeal, though they are also shunned by the power structure. The issue of gatekeeping notwithstanding, of course. In other words, what we today call the left is in the business of gatekeeping for the power structure, not challenging, not influencing it, and not seeking or getting any structural changes or improving the material conditions of workers. As Carl Schmitt said, "Tell me who your enemies are, and I will tell you who you are." Over the past few years, the left's enemies were people who disobeyed the IMF and Big Pharma, who disregarded the fact-checkers and the so-called experts, who questioned the corruption of Western elites and who opposed having their businesses closed, and who questioned the most obscene social conditioning we've ever seen. In other words, the left enemies are anyone who disobeys or is in annoyance to the power elite and their narratives. Just to break the fourth wall for a moment here, this was a script I was working on before the current situation in the Ukraine began, and needless to say, they were at the forefront of banging the war drums and attempting to drag the West into open conflict with Russia. I'm not saying anything particularly new here. The real question is to what degree the left still exists beyond a few old-school tankies. If a political or ideological movement has been reduced to nothing more than a withered stump protruding from the main mass of the power centre, then to what degree is it autonomous? The obvious counter to this line of thinking would be to say that the left won and that their ideas now dominate the system, but it seems to me that almost all of their ideas were creations of the system itself, and in the last few years they adopted without question whatever was demanded of them. Going into bat for Big Pharma and war abroad is not in any way a standard leftist position. Once again, contrast the right-winger wondering whether his favourite new free speech platform of choice is about to be banned in his country to the millionaire leftist streamer who buys a house in the Hollywood Hills. It isn't as if these issues came out of nowhere either. Back when leftists used to read books instead of super chats, people such as Theodore Adorno and Walter Benjamin of the infamous Frankfurt School studied the culture of the West and especially America. Cinema, for example, was seen as a de-radicalizing agent, not just the actual content but the form itself, which reduced the individual to a passive subject being trained to accept the framing of the capitalist system. Decades later, Mark Fisher returned to the topic at a more advanced stage with some observations on the movie Wall-E. The earlier incarnations of cinema reduced the masses to passive consumers of culture and by and large pandered to what the left would regard as reactionary impulses. It reinforced societal norms and structures. Many a leftist academic would look down upon this manipulation with contempt, but as time passed, cinema would also adopt leftist ideas and hand them back to the passive audience. Wall-E has an anti-consumerist message, and as my buddy Endeavour noticed on his video essay about it, that can also be detected as a message for reactionaries too. But Fisher's point is that such messaging actually serves to de-radicalise the left because the structure remains the same regardless. You're still a rat in a trap. Social media removes a degree of the passivity, but it does not take you out of the trap. The trap is simply expanded and you're allotted an ego boost and financial incentives for peddling the message the system once peddled. If you don't go along with the program, then you're out of the trap. This is why when we look at the left's enemies, they're not much more than people who hold counter-narratives on social media, while the right, out in the wastelands, are focused on institutional and structural issues. The issues that the left have vacated in order to become court jesters playing at bashing Donald Trump or Joe Rogan with the wooden swords given to them by their masters. You really have to hand it to the establishment on the way they lobotomised the left. An anti-war, anti-capitalist, anti-nuclear weapons movement are now dancing a jig as global finance cripples a sovereign nation. They express opinions so hawkish they'd make the most right-wing Cold War general blush, and they happily jeer as dissenting voices are purged. I've mentioned before that Twitter has a demonic aura to it, and now the largest echo chamber of them all could very well be in the process of driving us toward nuclear war. As I wrap this rather rambling video up, I happened to see a clip of an old general on American TV, a sane man trying to explain to lunatics how dangerous this new crisis was becoming. He doesn't have any institutional power either, and had the look about him of a Roman soldier who's just been informed his emperor has married a horse. The lunatics are in control, and the absolute monopoly on narrative ensures that we're locked onto a destructive course, like a train with a dead driver locked in his control room. This is in stark contrast to the previous crisis, which has just exited the public conscious. There's plenty of days of burying bad news at the moment, and there's a lot of inconvenient facts being buried under the bombs falling on Ukraine. The first crisis stank of manipulation and coordination, as if we were pawns in somebody else's grand master plan. The new crisis doesn't seem to have anyone planning or controlling anything. We're all just being dragged along in the wake of the system's court jesters, as the new national leaders seem to be caught like rabbits in headlights. And that's not surprising, really, because the Western mainstream has become locked in the giant echo chamber of its own making. What really is the difference between a far-right Telegram chat and the mainstream media and big tech now, except for scale and power? The obsession with optics and narrative has consumed the real and actual because the Western mainstream exists in the digital cinema and needs an endless supply of stimulation through images and positive news stories. The conflict in Ukraine is reduced to content, to analogies to Marvel movies and memes. Everybody can play their role in the great mimetic struggle, and everyone can get lots of likes and follows, including the politicians and leaders. One Reddit thread on Westerners going to fight on the front lines, warned that war in Ukraine would be like playing Call of Duty on hard mode, where you die once you get shot. Death is now just game over. Each crisis breeds its own personalities which get thrown in the limelight. And in this one of them that's popped up is John Mearsheimer, a geopolitical strategist who saw all of this coming and explained in great detail how and why. Mearsheimer advocates for policies based on realism. In the Valley of the Blind, the one-eyed man is king. In the age of hyper-reality, the realist is king. The Ghost of Kiev is hyper-reality. A column of tanks grinding its way along a poorly maintained muddy road is reality. In his recent speech announcing military operations, Vladimir Putin brought up the issue of America undermining traditional values within itself and across the West. This too, of course, has been carried out dutifully by the zombified left, and to such an extent have our values been inverted that we've become, in the eyes of others and many in our own nations, a force for anti-civilization. And if that's the case, then the real enemies of the left are now humanity itself. Tradition versus social justice, the human versus transhuman, hyper-reality versus reality. These, in my opinion, are the fault lines and battlefields that will define the 21st century. Once again, I'm reminded of my favourite line from Lovecraft. There was a demoniac alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown.